everyone, and welcome to Upstream. I hope you're enjoying the day so far. My name is Chris Grams. I'm the head of marketing for Tidelift. And as the head of marketing, I'm wearing my full Upstream regalia here today. So glad to be with you. I'm going to give a quick talk today, a lightning talk on the findings from our most recent 2022 open source software supply chain survey. And I'd love for y'all to follow along with me. You can actually download the full report now, either use this handy QR code or click the little click URL here if you want to. And by the way, I also want to give a shout out to Lawrence Hecht. He's Lawrence Hecht on Twitter, and you should go follow him. He was my research partner on this project. He and I have worked together on several projects. If you follow his Twitter feed, he's always got the latest survey data if you're interested in survey information for developers. But thank you, Lawrence. Really appreciate your help on this. What I'm gonna do today is give you a couple of the top findings from this report, and it's gonna go really fast. So anytime you wanna see more detail, you wanna go back and look at this, just download this report now. Hopefully I've talked enough over the screen that you had a chance to get the URL. All right, here we go. Finding number one from the survey. This is not going to be a surprise to anyone. Security is open source developers' most urgent challenge, while complying with government requirements is an emerging concern. So first slide I want to show you is this one. We asked in our survey, what are the things that development teams struggle most with when it comes to using open source software? And this is like, first we just asked them what they struggle with most. And number one was identifying and resolving security vulnerabilities. Number two and number three were very, very close in terms of overall things that teams struggle with, making good decisions about when to upgrade components and frameworks, and making good decisions about which components and versions to use. And then everything else kind of drops off, figuring out which components are safe and approved at my organization, resolving licensing issues, complying with government requirements, figuring out how to use open source components is a lengthy or confusing process. So the top three were really clear in this. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to dive in a little deeper, and we wanted to understand of those challenges. So we asked a follow-on question to when people respond to that one. We said, what is the most urgent challenge for your organization? So they could only pick one. And far and away, the most urgent challenge was identifying and resolving security vulnerabilities. And granted, this survey, I should say, went into the field in December of last year. So the survey was actually in the field when the Log4Shell vulnerability came out. So it was really interesting. I'll come back to that a little bit later and share some results. The other thing I want to point out here is we separated the data in terms of large companies with more than 10,000 employees, medium-sized companies with 1,000 to 10,000 employees, and less than 1,000. And identifying and resolving security vulnerabilities, the bigger the company, the more frequently it was named as the most urgent challenge. And diving into that a little bit more with large organizations over 10,000 employees, one thing that we thought was really, really interesting is just looking at all of these challenges. Big companies face all of these challenges at a much larger scale than the smaller companies do. So every single thing we asked about was basically half or more people identified as a challenge, all the way up to making good decisions about which components and versions to use. And those largest companies over 10,000 employees was ubiquitous, 87% viewed that as a challenge. And I'd also point down at the bottom, complying with government requirements was viewed as a challenge by 48%. And I should point out on this previous slide, complying with government requirements in those largest companies outpaced by far in the smaller company. 13% said that was the most urgent challenge compared to only 4% or 3% in the smaller companies. So really, really interesting how, as you start to see new things like this White House executive order on cybersecurity, how complying with government requirements is becoming a big challenge for large organizations. Okay, and final slide in this section. We asked this question in a previous survey a couple of years ago in 2020. The only one we added was the complying with government requirements, which we just have seen as an emerging issue. But everything else, we would say in those largest organizations over 10,000 employees, all of these things are increased since the last time we asked this question. So challenges with managing open source, they're happening more and more within organizations. Okay, finding number two, only 15% of organizations are extremely confident in their open source management practices. The majority have some concerns. So breaking it down, we asked the question, how confident are you that the open source components your organization is using are up to date, secure, and well maintained? 15% extremely confident. 22% not very or not at all confident. the vast majority of people fell into this category of somewhat confident. So if you think about this for a second, I'm a UNC, a University of North Carolina basketball fan. When I was watching the national championship this year, Carolina made it, as anyone who is a fan knows, to the national championship game as a huge underdog this year. And they were up by 15 at halftime against Kansas. I was somewhat confident that Carolina was going to win the game. And those of you who watched it will remember that Carolina actually lost that game. They lost, and they lost going away at the end of the game too. So somewhat confident when it comes to ensuring the open source components in your organization are up to date, secure, and well maintained. Is that good enough? Good question. One other thing that we found that was really interesting is we went and triangulated the results of that question against another question we asked in the survey about whether organizations are using software bills of materials. And we're going to come back and talk more about software bills of materials because those are one of the main things coming out of these government requirements that organizations are starting to get focused on. So in organizations that are using SBOMs for at least a few applications in some of their business segments, they were actually much more confident in the open source they're using than organizations that are not using SBOMs. All right, finding number 3. We asked about which open source languages people are using and how confident they are in basically how well those languages are secured and maintained. And so one of the things we found over time is the top 3 languages kind of far and away are Python, Java, and JavaScript. The rest of these things are used at other levels. You can see in the little n equals down at the bottom, you go from 400 people responded with Python, 333 with Java, 394 with JavaScript, and then the n equals goes down to 163 or so for the next group. So, sort of 2-3x people using those top 3 languages. Well, what we found in the survey was that the percentage of people that were extremely or somewhat confident in Python was the highest. Of these top 3 languages, the percentage that were not very or not at all confident was the highest for JavaScript. It'd be interesting in the comments if people have thoughts on whether that matches with their experience. Okay, great. Finding number 4, getting approval to use new open source components in large organizations is often slow and tedious. So we asked about whether organizations have any sort of evaluation or approval process for bringing in new open source components in their organization. And what we found is that 61% of organizations have some sort of approval process. They either have a formal process in which multiple departments or functions are responsible for approval. They have a formal process with a centralized committee, in some cases 18%. 22% have an approval process that requires authorization for a specific person or team. But then 38% either have no approval process. Each developer is bringing in their own open source components. And 19% said they have some sort of informal process that doesn't require any sort of approval. Okay, so dialing into that a little bit more, by the size of organizations again, we found that that number increases from 61% to 78% with the largest organizations. So 78% of the largest organizations have some sort of formal approval process for introducing new open source components. So what does that mean? Basically it means that these organizations are, if a developer wants to bring in a new component, they're actually having to go through some sort of bureaucratic process, hopefully a pretty easy process, but not always. And that's what we're going to dive into next. We asked, how long does it take for you to get a new component approved through the process that you have? And 50%, half of respondents said it takes between a day and a week. So I don't know, just think about your own experience. If you're a developer, would you view a day to get a new component approved as fast? That probably depends on the size organization you have. Would a week be fast? But for this 39% where it's taking between a week and a month, or more than a month, can you imagine? Like 10% of organizations, it takes more than a month to get a new component approved. I just kind of wonder about how, if you're a developer in an organization, how that feels like when you're sitting there waiting for a new component to get approved. And in the largest organizations, it gets even more bleak. You see, in the largest organizations, it takes more than a week to get a new component approved, more than half of the time. So that's sort of an interesting thought. Is that slowing down development? Is this approval process and the amount of time, is it slowing down developers' ability to use open source really effectively? Okay, great. Finding number 5, the best practice of centrally managing a repository of approved open source components is growing rapidly. So we asked the question, how widely are centralized inventories and or repositories used to track open source components? This is something that we've been really interested in as part of Tidelift's approach to managing open source, is helping organizations create a catalog of approved open source components that developers can kind of draw from and not have to do all the work themselves of ensuring whether it's properly licensed, whether that is secure, whether you're using the best version. This was surprising to us that 65% of organizations are already either are using it or piloting it in some way. And another 9% on top of that have plans to use it in the next year. Now, only 22% of organizations are using it for most or all applications. So I would view this as an emerging trend. And we've seen some of the top analyst firms also indicate through their advice, and in particular, Gartner and IDC have talked about a repository of approved components being a best practice for organizations to start using. Interesting to see that we're still early days, but some organizations are starting to use this. And again, in the biggest organizations, it's even more pronounced. 76% are at least piloting or using it for a few or almost all applications, and another 9%, so a full 85% of organizations are planning to do it in the next year, are already doing it. Only 15% have no near-term plans to use. Finding number 6, only 37% of organizations are aware of new government software supply chain requirements around security and SBOMs, software bill of materials, as I talked about earlier. Really simple finding here. We just asked before the survey, were you aware of the May 2021 White House executive order on cybersecurity, which has kicked off a whole series of new initiatives with different groups within the government and also private companies and public companies looking to figure out how they need to comply with these requirements. The idea behind this White House executive order is that if you want to sell to the government, you need to bring up your level of cybersecurity, and you need to understand better the provenance of the components you're using, i.e. where they come from. You need to understand how they're secure, who's making them. And in open source, that can be fairly challenging. So we wanted to see, are people aware of this? It turns out that a large percentage were not aware of it prior to the survey. That may have changed since, again, this survey was in the field during Log4Shell, and certainly there have been a lot of things happening over the last couple of months that I suspect when we do this survey next, that this number will change significantly. Finding number 7, 78% of organizations are already using SBOMs for application development or have plans to in the next year. So we asked the question, just to the people who were aware of that executive order on cybersecurity, we asked them, which of the following describe how your organization is currently using SBOMs for application development? 78% said they're either using it, piloting it, or planning to use SBOMs in the next year. Only 22% say their organization does not use SBOMs or does not have plans to use SBOMs. And again, final data point on this, looking at the largest organizations, that number jumps from 78% to 84% for the largest organizations over 10,000 employees. So a couple of emerging trends we saw out of this survey. Use of SBOMs is increasing. Organizations are really starting to use those repositories of approved components in a much bigger way. And again, the well-duh headline that everybody knows, but should also be aware of, is security is the most urgent challenge for organizations when using open source. All right, that is your quick talk on the 2022 Open Source Supply Chain Survey Report. Thank you. Again, if you'd like to download the full report, the link is here. All of these charts are in there, as well as many more interesting findings. And thanks, as always, to those of you who actually took the survey. We do it every year, and we'd love your feedback next time. All right, enjoy the rest of Upstream.